All right, then I'll call this meeting to order. We have all three of the board members present, and there are no registered public comments. I'd like to have approve of the agenda with the idea of moving item 6 ahead of item 5 and just switching those two. Is there such a motion?
So moved. Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, and so again, no public comments, so we will immediately go to item 6, the November 2022 referendum planning process.
So what we really wanted to cover with everyone tonight was just first of all, some high level discussions regarding referendum planning, and share with you a little bit about what we're doing at the January board meeting and then planning ahead for the next couple of months and how the information that Eric has prepared for us really fits into the conversations. So to begin with, Mark Roffers is joining us at the January school board meeting. So next Monday night. Mark is our long-term planner. So we've been working with Mark to get that information ready for you. It will be in your packet. So there's a very long PowerPoint that'll be in your packet. And we're asking Mark to just give us information for the board members on what the highlights are. Coming out of the January meeting, we're also going to have Eric share the information he's going to share with you tonight, which is really some high-level financial data. I know as board members, you've been asking for this high-level data for a couple of months and how it relates to referendum planning. So Eric's going to talk about that. And then Randy and I are going to talk about how that then will connect into the community survey. So we'll share some information with you as well about how the options, the information from Mark and the information from Eric can feed into the development of a community survey. And then we also want to bring drafts of that community survey back to the board for your review. We're looking at trying to give you a couple of opportunities to look at that community survey, hopefully the February meeting as well as the March meeting, and then launch it after spring break. But what I'm going to do is turn it over to Eric for a couple of minutes and have Eric walk you through it at a high level. What would be possible next November with a referendum for both a capital question and an operational referendum question without having any impact on the taxpayers? And so Eric's going to walk you through this. It's a little complicated because it also involves the district paying down debt. As you know, the board approved paying down debt this past fall. So Eric is projecting what that will look like in a few months. We will have the potential to pay down debt next fall. So we're planning for that as well. And so Eric will walk you through that process. So I want to give him enough time to kind of talk through that spreadsheet and then get any questions that you have answered or anything that you think would be helpful for the board members next Monday night as well regarding this conversation. So I'm going to open up the final or the example financing plan, Eric, on the screen. And if you wouldn't mind just talking through the board members, what they're looking at and what that looks like for a potential November referendum.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for the opportunity to kind of walk through this information. Again, my name is Eric Cass, Director of Public Finance for PMA. We've been working with Steve for a couple months now, kind of putting together some different scenarios to kind of answer that ultimate question is what is the opportunity as it relates to a potential capital and or operational referendum. So just want to stress that, you know, the 75 million isn't an exact number. It's just kind of a bogey or a target that we identified, and the operational referendum that we'll walk through here can also be interchangeable. So don't walk out of this conversation that these are the numbers that, you know, we think are appropriate. And I don't know that Steve feels that way either. So a couple of things as it relates to what you're looking at here. Want to walk through the format and then talk through some of the assumptions and then kind of the logistics of what we're looking at here. So on the far left, before you get to the box that is titled 75 million GO school building bonds, what you're looking at there is the first column is your existing debt service. So the best way to think about that is on an annual basis, what do you need to levy for property taxes in order to pay your debt obligations on an annual basis. As Steve alluded to earlier, for the last few years, there's been an umbrella levy strategy as it relates to the mill rate, which last year was $10.89, that has allowed the school district to levy some additional funds within Fund 39 and begin to pay off debt earlier. So that's that second column. What you're looking at there is the example impact of a 2022 and 2023 defeasance, the positive numbers being the additional levy that would be available and the negative numbers being the maturities that are paid off and ultimately the savings created. So when you look at that column, what that's telling us is actual additional levy of 4.8 million that the board approved this last November, plus a projected additional 6.3 next fall that we feel is conservative. Would you get to the bottom line when put into action through a defeasance process will save the local property taxpayers about $1.4 million on your existing debt. So that's a pretty good story. It's about a 14% savings on that additional 10 million, putting that into context. And what you see in that third column is kind of what your existing debt service obligations need to be moving forward. You see the two large ones, the 12 million and the 13. So that's what you currently are required plus the additional. And then we get into a position when we're bringing on new debt and your operational referendums coming on, which I'll highlight here in a second, where you're just kind of paying down your existing debt in terms of the framework of what's still remaining. That middle box is the $75 million potential capital referendum. So that was kind of the last piece we figured out. And so I'm going to come back to that here in a minute. The first piece we figured out is two columns to the right of that, titled Recurring Operating Override. So one of the things Steve asked us to look at is if we overlaid a 1.2 to 2.4, so increasing by 1.2 all the way up to 6 million, that would be in place in the 2026-27 school year, and then would continue at 6 million. So a $1.2 million recurring referendum that would increase each year for a period of 5 years and cap out at 6 million. So once we built that in, then we kind of what we call reverse engineered what would the capacity still be on the levy as it relates to having no mill rate impact for a new capital referendum in November of 2024. And what you're looking at in that middle box is a $75 million capital referendum where your first payment would be levied for in the 2023 school year. So it'd be a November of 2022 referendum, issue debt and start construction in the summer of 23. And then your first payments would come online there if you see the $470,000 principal, which is the first line, and then continue down through. So what does all this mean is if you go all the way to the right, you can see that there's a combined mill rate category. So when we isolate your Fund 39 levy as a portion of the total tax mill rate of $10.89, we know that in 2021, that equaled $3.50. That's that first number. So that's the target that we were looking at when we built the recurring referendum impact, as well as what is the opportunity for a capital referendum alongside of that. And as you see all the way through, that levels out at $3.50. Now, one assumption that I want to highlight that's very important that allows us to manage to that 350 for a short period of time is down at the bottom. In 2022 through 2026, there's an assumption of a 3% property valuation growth. 2027 and thereafter, so for the majority of this projection, we're assuming a 0% property value growth. So we feel that is very conservative. The 3% for the first 4 years is very normal. We normally land in that 2.5% to 3% for a community like Waunakee. Just had this conversation with Verona earlier, and we did the same thing for the first 5 years and then leveled that off to make sure that we could actually, go to the community if there is interest at any point in time with an operational and a capital in this vicinity of the 75 and then the total of 6 million, and have a conversation from a tax perspective that the mill rate would not increase as it relates to the operational referendum and the capital referendum. With that, I would be happy to answer any other questions or any thoughts that folks have related to those two options.
Question.
That's one of the questions, is this reoccurring operating override. The debt levy would be building, right? And then this is 6 million recurring. And what's in that 6 million?
Sure. So the 6 million, excuse me, is just an estimate that we wanted to use to be able to show you what a capital referendum combined with an operational referendum would look like. As Eric stated, there's flexibility between the two. So as an example, the board might prefer a capital referendum that's 80 million or 85 million or 65 million. And so this is designed to show how the two of those work together to try to get the tax rate to remain the same for the community. Ultimately, in the end, the board hasn't even selected a plan yet, right? So we don't know if we'd be building a middle school, an elementary school, et cetera. Once we get further down the road, we put together very specific cost estimates for you that would say, as an example, 3 custodians at this new school, or 2 office staff, or the utilities will be X. This is just designed today to show how a combination of these two could result in a similar tax rate of 350. What we didn't want to do is come in tonight and show $125 million capital referendum to stay at the 350, and then come back a couple months later and say, oh, well, we forgot to mention that there also should be an operational referendum question. So this is designed to show the complete picture of a referendum and how both the capital question and the operational question could work together to look at that goal that the board established of a consistent tax rate across years. And as Eric mentioned, if during this process this spring, the board lands on a plan that costs 85 million or 90 million, Eric and his team will then be able to show us what would an operational referendum then look like to be consistent with the $3.50. Or if the opposite occurs and the board wanted to do something else, he could do the same thing. So really you could look at this from the lens of, because of that defeasance strategy and the approach of keeping a consistent tax rate, this preliminary analysis would show we could go to referendum next fall with a combination of a capital question at 75 million and an operational question at 6 million, and not change the tax rate for the school portion. Now, you probably read in the paper that there's discussions going on at the village level about interacting with the public on a pool. So we're just referencing the school part. And so we would never be able to say to someone that their total property tax bill wouldn't change, but we would be able to say to someone that the portion of the school district tax rate, if that type of a referendum was approved, would remain the same. The other thing Eric referenced that he said was really important was that property value increase. We have been historically well above the range that Eric is referencing, but it's always been important for the school board in the past to outperform the financial data that we share with the public. And what I mean by that is you show a tax rate of 350 and you present a tax impact a certain way. And then if the community grows larger than 3%, 4%, 5%, we've actually created a financial plan that has a lower impact than what we actually described. And throughout the time I've been here, that's been a goal of the board, was to be conservative in these type of analyses. So we could go back to the community a year or two later and say, it didn't even cost what we told you it would cost. Dave, you remember that from the last referendum. In fact, it didn't even come close to what we described that the 2014 referendum would cost. We worked with PMA on that 2014 referendum, and the public was incredibly a very positive reaction to what we ended up doing because we used some strategies that we didn't even have anywhere close to the tax increase that we described. So one take, Dave, might be that the 3% is too conservative and you should increase it a little bit. We can do that. You know, Eric can run the calculations and show what would it be at a different percent. But it's always been a goal of the board for us to try to perform better than what we share with the public.
I think the 2014 referendum, we did a similar strategy. The growth was higher and the new growth actually paid for that school. So that's really how that came out in this one. So I think this was a piece I think, Dave, you've been asking for since we started the conversation around referendum planning was what's kind of the general ballpark of what's a zero impact. And that's some of the strategies we put in place over the last few years. This is generally kind of the ballpark of where we're at to get to zero.
Any other questions?
Can you explain and I mean, I know that we've seen this in this district and other districts when you separate the building referendum and the operating referendum. One is dependent on the other. And yet it doesn't really come across that way to people, or let's say the operating impact. I mean, they're really linked.
Right.
It isn't.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ted, because we've seen that here. So in
Yeah.
2010, the high school expansion passed and the operational referendum failed. So in the end, the district budget had to absorb the increase in operational costs. Now, thankfully, it was on the minimal side because it was just an addition. It wasn't a significant, cost like a brand new building, but you're right. They are closely connected. However, for the public, they have the ability to vote yes for one and no to the other, which does at times for school boards creates very difficult situations, right? The public could approve an operational referendum that quite frankly, you wouldn't need all of it if they voted no on the capital referendum. Or the other way could happen where a capital project gets approved and then ultimately you don't have the dollars to operate the school. And that's where in the past, school districts would keep coming back with that question as many times as they could, and now it's limited. So you can only ask the questions a defined period of time in a year. Eric, would you mind reviewing that with the board members for a moment?
Yeah, so the law changed a few years back where you can only go to referendum during a normal election, primary, or a general election. So for all intents and purposes, you only have one opportunity every other year in November because there is only a gubernatorial and or a presidential every other year. And then you have two spring opportunities. The more popular is the general election in April for a lot of local offices and state offices that happen. But you do also have a primary opportunity. And then to Steve's other point, there is a limit on the number of questions you can ask in any calendar year, and that is capped at 2. So if you were to go, for example, in November of 22 with an operational and a capital question, you could certainly do that because you would not have gone at any other point in time to ask the community in 2022. Then you would also have the opportunity for whatever reason, if things didn't work out in your favor, to go again in April. But if you asked 2 questions in April, you'd be done for the calendar year. Even though there is no November election, you're kind of capped at, again, at that 2 question, as well as when are the general elections and primaries available for a local referendum.
Go back to your question that you initially asked, Ted, was by law, we have to ask them as 2 questions. Because one's a bonding referendum, one's a bonding question to borrow money, and the other one is to exceed the revenue cap. So you have to, legally have to ask them separately if you're going to be asking those. You can't time together.
And is the operating reference here totally the portion just for this, or it's operating referendum that could be used for the operations in general across the district?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it would be worded that in general, they're worded so that the funds can be used in any manner. But boards can limit them. So in the past, we've had questions that have had X amount for maintenance, X amount for technology. But as an example, the one that we did in November of 2020, was open. It was $2.1 million. Now, we described it to the public as initially being related to COVID expenditures, and that's where the funds went. But the question did not say in it specifically for COVID expenses or nothing else. So generally speaking, they're left open, but boards can, have some restrictions on there for things like maintenance or technology if you wanted to.
And then when we get to the point where we define what that number is, we have to have some explanation as we go out and talk to the community about this, of really what is that going for? It's to Jack's question of what's the 6 million for? We would have a general idea about what types of things would that be lined up for, why are we asking for that? That's not part of this. This is just a modeling exercise here.
Yep.
But I think part of what this gets to, and this gets to kind of our part of our next conversation, which is how do we then, what options do we have as we move forward with the projects? So if you truly wanted to just stay at the 0, you're probably building a elementary school or you're building a middle school. But to do both of them under this one referendum, that's going to exceed 75 million. That's going to be much larger. So when we get into our survey planning for the community, which is what we're in the midst of right now, and what Steve said we'll bring back to the board, I think we have to talk about those 2 projects, but we also have to talk about, is there a desire to ask them together and have a larger number, and then just know what the delta is of that difference between the 0 at 75 and whatever the combined number would be.
So basically,
We could give the community a choice there so that they can see the 0 piece and what you could do with that, but also could see what the impact would be if you ask them together and vet that out.
Yep, and the other thing I just want to mention to make sure you have it on your radar, I wasn't quite sure how to put it on something that has a lot of complicated variables like what Eric is presenting. But you got to keep in mind that the $2.1 million non-recurring referendum goes away in 2025. So in this planning, there's going to be a minus $2.1 million as well that's going to occur. So this is typically, when you see a sample financial plan, it's typically around debt service, but we wanted to also show you the operational question. But another thing to keep in mind is 2.1 million will go away as well, which does need to ultimately be factored into this. And I think we'll end the dialogue with just making sure, is there anything different that as board members you would like to have Eric calculate? Would you like him to run any of these scenarios in a different way so you have that now for your review? Or is this enough information for you to at least have off the top of your head for the next couple of months as we start talking about this?
I think we should run the numbers for the scenarios we had at the end of our last run at this 2 years ago. We had what, 5 different potential layouts at that time, I believe.
I don't recall.
It was around that, but we can drag those back out and at least put the numbers next to those so we can know, as you bring up.
We had like, or if I think I'm getting at what you're asking, Dave, we had like 75, 100, 125, 150. And I think we had them kind of costed at those levels. That was mainly the general obligations.
And that was under the idea that we had the middle school only out at the intermediate site. We had the partial changing heritage to a newer elementary, modifying heritage, totally tearing heritage down, were the levels we were looking at.
We kind of did this exercise and we did it with those kind of increments.
Right.
And then from there, you could at least extrapolate generally where some of the projects would go once we had some estimates and costs.
I think the other thing we should have is his history on the percent growth number. I remember we used to have a 1-page thing that showed it like over the last 20 years.
Yep.
And I believe it was well over 3, such that that growing average was almost close to 5.
Yep.
Because while I agree with being conservative, and I would never say go with the rolling average number, but being way below it also means you leave so much on the table that the growth just catches up to you again. And we end up in the same boat we are now within 5 years of renting more mobile classrooms. So we should at least know the number we're really semi-expecting.
So if we go back and pull up that document from before, pre-COVID, when we were looking at those options, I can share that with Eric. Ask him to add some columns that connect to those options. And we will show, obviously it'll go over the 350, but then you can see it. And then also gather like a 20-year history of our equalized value growth. Is there anything else that anybody would be interested in?
How do you, I think one of the things that would be interesting as well is, if you break these in two, we know we need buildings, but being conservative, can you run a scenario where you get this for one, and then 5 years later, 4 years later, you've got, another scenario that you say, okay, we're going to do this again. What does that do?
Does anyone recall, was that one of the 5 that Dave was referring to?
There was a plan initially presented about running it as 2 referendums, and I think that had to do with the architects and with Vogel.
Yeah, part of what we talked about, and that's what you're getting.
It showed a higher construction cost.
Was we look at is there a benefit to doing it all at once when you're all mobilized together versus 2 separate entities? And at that point, it did have an indicator that running the larger referendum had merit from, and I think a lot of it was like the staging pieces with the construction companies coming in, disbanding and coming back.
And then I believe there was also the concept that we could spread the costs of the bonding over 5 years worth, so that you had almost the same effect of spreading the money out anyway, and you didn't have to restart your construction team again. I think that was where the major
I think
difference
that
was.
was fair. Michelle ran this. I think I probably still have them in my file, but we can.
So we'll pull that out, and Jack will take a look at what you're talking about as well. So Eric, we can connect and run through those scenarios and get that information back, so you will have it during this discussion. So thanks for the feedback. Anything else that you would like to see Eric present? Thank you, Eric. Thanks for zooming in.
Yep, thank you. Have a good evening.
You too. Take care.
Bye now.
All right, then, based on that, we'll go back to item number 5, which is the facility project management option.
Becky, you want me to pull it up or you click over your clicks? So thanks, Dave. So what we wanted to do was circle back to the discussion on facility project management options. And I just wanted to take a moment and review some of the processes that we've had in place in our district over the years, and then just get your perspective on how you would like to see us consider planning for the future. So I'm going to open up this file really quick. Just going to start with sharing with you. I'm going to start basically right here. And I want to talk about from 1997 to 2004, what we did as a district for facilities and facility maintenance department. So from 1997 to 2004, we had 2 administrative positions in the facility and custodial department. We had a director of facilities that was more of a project-based position, and we had a supervisor of custodial services. So the director of facilities, his name was Mike Brady. The supervisor of custodial services was Kenny Derricks. When Mike Brady retired, Kenny Derricks went back into the role and we went back to one position. So as an organization, we did operate for a period of time under having two administrators in the department with each having different focuses. Then in 2004, when Mike Brady retired and we went to the community with back-to-back referendums in 2004 and 2005, the board requested that the district hire what was called an owner's rep. So we put out a request for proposals for owner's reps. We ended up hiring a gentleman named Tom Knack, who worked for the district from 2004 to 2013. And Tom billed us at about a rate of $125,000 per year for about 2 to 3 days per week of service. So that was the approach that we took as a district from about 2004 to 2013. In the 2014 referendum, we went in a different route. This was our first time working with Epstein Ewan, and Epstein, in their proposal to the board for architectural services, provided us with an on-site construction manager who was here more often than the individual we used to have from Bray Architects. So that model in 2014 was a director of facilities and administrative assistant, and then Epstein and at that time Findorf working together on the construction project. But we did not have an owner's rep in the district, and we had Joe Bellamo in the director of facilities position. One downside to that approach that we learned was how deep Randy and I kept getting pulled into facility related discussions, like drainage issues at the intermediate school and playground issues at Heritage, and we could go on, but we ended up spending quite a bit of time working through a lot of facilities issues. So that was a little bit of a downside from that approach. But we've really taken a variety of different approaches going back to 1997. They all have different impacts on costs. They have different impacts on our internal ability to manage projects. The savings column that I created here really references the fact that as the district does more project work ourselves, we save on architectural costs, we save on construction manager costs. And there's just a variety of different ways to approach this. In the last couple of months, we've shared with you a job description for supervisor of custodial services. You shared an interest in, let's have a higher level discussion about a variety of different ways that we could do it. And I talked about, why don't I just put together a little history and a range of options, and let's just have a discussion on what the facility committee members are thinking, what you'd be interested in seeing. As an example, as a committee, you could ask us to go out and issue a request for proposal for a project engineer or owner's rep services to see what might be available. Or maybe as a committee, you're saying, no, we're not interested in doing that. We don't want you to issue a request for proposal. We're here to basically move forward in whatever approach that you are comfortable with. We just want to be prepared. So if you want to know what an owner's rep would cost or what a project engineer would cost, we want to get going on that so we can present that information to you in the next couple of months. Or if there's some other option that you want us to explore, we're happy to do that. We just want to start moving down a certain direction so that you can have the information you need to try to make a decision on which path we take moving forward. Jack?
Just a question on the estimated project management capacity. That's your summer projects, basically.
Yep.
So, generally we're spending $500,000 to $700,000.
Right, exactly.
So, and then we don't have more in the budget for it.
Right, exactly. Yep.
So it's great that we can get up to $2 to $5 million capacity, but you're not gonna have the funding.
Right, so the question, what really comes up is again related to the November referendum. So like Randy mentioned, if there is a decision to go down, let's say an elementary school path, and let's just say for discussion's sake, that's $50 million. And let's say the board does want to move forward with a $75 million referendum and look at the $20 million in deferred maintenance on that list. And let's say the board wants to tackle that. And so the referendum, again, let's say that it is an elementary school and 20 million in referendum in projects. That could lead the board to saying, we don't want Epstein and or Vogel to manage all of that. We want to try to handle the carpeting and the electrical upgrades and whatever else it would be ourselves. Which is why in the past on that very bottom line, that's what happened. Is when we were looking at referendums in 2014 or 2004 and 2005, there were maintenance projects associated with those referendums, and the board said, we want the district to manage as much of these as we can, so we're going to bring in an owner's rep. And that person basically were totally independent of the contractor or the architect at that time, and took on projects on behalf of the district to get that work done. So that's what we're referring to, Jack, is yes, there is that possibility that depending on how this plays out over the next couple of months, there could be a referendum question this November that has a large component on, let's say, clearing the deck on those maintenance projects that John has been working with Vogel on, that I know pre-COVID, this committee was looking at it, and I don't know, Randy or John, refresh my memory, it was in the $20 to $25 million range, I believe.
I think you ended at like 20, that was what we were last time, but early figure.
So those numbers though, that 20, let's say 20 million, that has to be done in 5 years. Or what's the sunset?
It would be the 5 years. Yeah.
5 years.
Yep.
So it's about 4 million.
Yep.
I'd like to have a question on the savings when you're saying that there's an asterisk there, but doesn't say what the asterisk means. But is that savings after the additional cost? Or is that just savings in general that subtract the additional cost and that's your result?
Yeah, so the savings references that asterisk above the table that says it's related to architectural construction management fees average at 3%. So what it would be doing is taking the column that said estimated project management capacity and just multiplying that by 3%. So in some of the scenarios, let's say the scenario of the owner's rep, at least our experience was, it was about $125,000 a year position. If that person is managing the lower end of the project cost, it actually would cost the district money because the savings would be only $90,000. If, however, they would be managing more like 2.5 million a year, I'm sorry, 5 million a year, it would be up to 180,000. So that's to your point, Jack, what are we asking and how much money is at stake each year? Because some of these options could actually cost us money if we went out and hired an owner's rep, but didn't give them enough work to do. We're actually going to be costing ourselves money.
So if you look at the supervisor, where you have a supervisor of the janitors, are you looking at a supervisor for each shift, or is it per building?
We would be looking at going back to, in effect, the model that the district used from 1997 to 2004, where you had two positions, one focused more on project and maintenance, one focused more on custodial services. And that's when we presented that job description, when John wrote that up. It was more along the lines of looking at what we were doing in 1997 to 2004, where a position could focus on the custodial end, a position could focus on really district-wide, maintenance and projects. And that model was pretty successful, but I think the main reason why the board switched in 2004 was a retirement happened and two big back-to-back referendums happened. And so the thought at that time was, let's go out and outsource these services instead of basically replacing the person who retired. So that the supervisor of custodial services really took over management of the entire department, and we added the owner's rep.
I guess a couple of things. The first item there, the current model, I don't think that's sustainable with the type of referendum that we have. It's lucky that's what we did this 2014 referendum, and I think it was too much. It was at that point. I mean, John, you weren't here. Joe was sitting in your seat, and between Joe, Steve, and I, we were on site in job trailers almost daily, dealing with things, being out in the field, looking at things that we needed some greater expertise. So I think, to me, that one's not a great option going into the type of referendum. The third one down was a bit of a vision when we brought John's position, when Joe retired and John was hired. There was a vision that we would start to work back towards that. We didn't do that initially, mainly for financial reasons. But I think that there's a day-to-day, away from the referendum piece, there's a day-to-day operational piece of needing to look at how can we provide better support and supervision of our custodial staff that would allow John's position then to be more focused on kind of the bigger, larger picture of managing projects, managing the maintenance piece, being regularly involved there. The interim one that we have there, which we haven't had an experience with, which is what came out of kind of, I think, our conversation at the last facilities meeting, which we haven't tried, is you elevate some of your custodial folks in the building, and they provide some of the supervision that of the custodial folks. The bottom one certainly works when you're in the referendum mode. It just has a cost aspect to it. And it's relatively expensive from a respect of, you have one person that's, I think you're right, Tom was only here a couple of days a week. He was kind of a good interim between our architects piece. He got us out of the field. He definitely had expertise in the area. It did have a larger cost from just an onset piece. But obviously, depending on what kind of projects they can manage, that can kind of offset. That's kind of my view on those four items.
Do you feel you have the people at each building for the second option? Or would that be a problem?
For the most part, I'm comfortable with that. We have a lot of custodians coming and going, so that would be a little bit of a challenge to keep a consistent supervisory level there. But I think for the most part, there are individuals in each building that are capable of looking at things that need to get done in the building as far as supervision piece.
Because it seems like a major point is going with the third option. If you don't get over $2.5 million worth of projects going every year, you're losing money again. But on the second option, you're really not putting that much money down, considering the fact that you're always within that range. And I gotta admit, I've always liked smaller work teams, more direct supervision. And if we're building our people within, they're the people who can then take the job later, instead of, putting all your people into one new person or whatever. As we've said before, if you do go for supervisor of custodial services, you're probably hiring somebody internally, which means you're probably pulling someone out of the building, and now you got to go replace that person, rather than developing 6 people who could all be useful, especially if you lose one.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dave. The theory behind the second option, I kind of skipped over when I was talking about our history. is to create a career path for custodians, right? Like ultimately, a lot of custodians have a goal of being a head custodian, but there's not that many of those positions and people stay in it for a long time. This would allow us to cultivate leadership within the custodial operations so that folks would have an opportunity to become a leader in that second shift, become a supervisor, something we're sorely missing right now. With that added responsibility, John would be able to shift additional duties to the building level to allow him to free up some time, some more time to focus on projects. We're throwing that out there because we do think there are some positive components to that. And it might be worth exploring. And I do think ideas about building career paths, building leadership teams at the site level, empowering the sites to do things like look at custodial applications, lead interview processes. I do think that's an option that we could explore. We threw it on there just for discussion because obviously it's not something we've done before. But if this was something you were interested in doing, we could ask Brian Grabarski to look at some wage schedules and see how we might create an evening custodial lead. We could create some job descriptions. Basically, we just want to start walking down a path that this committee feels comfortable with doing. You could ask us to walk down two paths. You could say, issue an RFP for owner's rep and also ask Brian to start exploring an internal option. And so let's start looking at paths 2 and 4. We just want to position ourselves so we are ready as the discussion for the November referendum is evolving.
So the question, in option number 2, you've got a supervisor for basically the day shift and the night shift.
Yep.
So all those are reporting to John.
Yep. Versus right now, there's nobody responsible for evenings other than John has to go oftentimes at the earlier part of the evening shift to work on supervisory issues, training issues, etc. because the head custodian's shift is done. So that leaves John. I don't know, you want to speak to that at all, John?
Well, that's absolutely what happens, like multiple evenings, I'll go to a school building to walk with the night employees there, whether it's reprimanding or just checking up with them or even training, so. But the head custodian's gone, there's lack of supervision after school, that's out, and that's been a major component from my side, and then the head custodian to deal with the next day. So it's challenging to address issues immediately, and that's the way we should do this, challenge issues immediately, especially with employees. Mr. Grabarski's been great with doing that with me as well when it's required. But again, it's usually after 5, 6 p.m.
So how are we running now? We've got a head custodian that is boss
Day shift primarily.
day shift and
And then like 2.5 evening custodians at like Arboretum that there isn't a supervisor there. Or at any of the schools at night.
they're doing a good job.
I would say they are. I would say they are. Again, their questions would wait till the morning for custodians or email communications, and some of the folks aren't really good at the technology bit, so they'll call me or the head custodian versus sending an email. So they're doing a good job, of course. And back to Dave's question, do we have a custodian in each building that can come up to this level? It's yet to be seen, and maybe we'd have to shift some people around. I think the cultural component to that could be an issue where I've had a person I've worked with at the same level, now they're my supervisor, and they're also cleaning and doing the same tasks. So there could be a little bit of a cultural shift there. I don't want to say animosity, but because they're good teams in our buildings, I think they would respect each other that way. But that's one thing I thought of.
So we've got a head custodian at each building. And they are the leadership, right, of the custodian team. So really what you're asking is to create a supervisory position for the next.
That's what that path would do, yes. Yeah, it would create, let's say right now we have pay categories, the custodian, courier, electrician. We'd add an evening lead that wouldn't be paid what the head custodian would be paid, but would be paid more than the custodial position, kind of in between. So it would be attractive to individuals and they would take on a leadership role in that building, and anything that we could do to have the team themselves take on more of the supervisory and leadership roles would allow John's role to work on more projects. And so it's certainly, at least we view it as a viable option to consider. But we would want to flush that out more. We want to bring you example pay grades. We'd want to bring you job descriptions. We'd want to make sure that we provided more information, but we just wanted to find out what's your temperature on each of these 4 options and which one should we keep exploring.
Well, it seems like option 2, creating opportunities. I'd also like to understand how many janitors you have in each building, second shift.
Sure.
If you've got 2 people, do they work as a team? Does someone need to really supervise them if they understand how they work? I can see probably the high school, where you're using a lot more resources because you got after hours activities and things like that.
Yeah, the high school is definitely bigger, and generally there aren't teams now. The training has become an issue. We have so many new employees, and it takes so many hours to train the new employees. We have been putting teams together, and actually our head custodian has been staying late quite a bit as well to help train the new employees. So it's absolutely a training part.
We bought a lot of new equipment for these guys. Is that supplier coming in and providing the training, or are we providing the training?
They have absolutely supplied the training. They're coming again tomorrow to meet with us. Back department. Yeah. So they're not going to come at 6 p.m. though and do a nightly training.
I guess at this
I would
point,
explore the second option.
we're just looking for feedback on what you would like us to explore, what you would like us to consider doing. If you have a preference for exploring that second option, we can at the next meeting bring back more information on that option, including what you're looking for, Jack. We could show you the whole team. We could talk about how this would work, sample costs, wage schedules, job descriptions, what we'd be asking for those folks, and then how it would impact John. We'd want to be able to show what exactly are some of the duties that we believe could be shifted to the site location, including what I would suggest would be the hiring of custodians. I think that's certainly something a head custodian along with an evening lead would be capable of doing, which would allow John to work more on projects.
Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah.
I'm curious on the 4th one. I mean, it's almost 10 years old. What the rates, if that's even reasonable now, or an RFP would result in,
We would definitely know.
Yeah.
If we did issue that, again, we could issue it. We could see what the responses are, and then you could take a look at what that path looks like, as long as that second, as well as the second path. We certainly don't have to just do one. We're not asking for any decisions to be made tonight, but if you were interested in us putting together information on project engineer and owners reps, we could get that out in the next 3 or so weeks and get a response back by the end of February. if that's something you wanted to see.
I mean, that would be like a contract that would work over a yearly.
Yep.
Be just a contracted service.
Yep.
And we went through a RFP process in 2010 referendum. Tom then, probably to 2008, and we went back to the RFP in 2010. He stayed with us until 13.
I gotta say that being in construction, PM positions haven't gotten cheaper.
No.
They've gone through the roof.
Right, that's why I'm curious. To see what-
I'm sure that 125 number is significantly higher now. And I hate to see you go through all the work of an RFP and deal with it all just to sit there and go, well, we'll just pretend it. I just don't see where that's a viable model compared to number 2 or even possibly number 3.
We didn't speak a lot about number 3. I gravitate toward that model simply because I think that one person could spend more time with me in the office, understanding the things that need to be done in each building, and then having that person be able to be in an authority role for each building and travel to each building and help out where needed. And again, in more of a role of authority versus a coworker. That's kind of how I compare models 2 and 3 there. It's an existing coworker or person that is representing me in the office here.
I mean, I was just, of the last one, does any of that relate totally to, or would any of it pertain to the referendum and taking some of that project management stuff over? Or is it just the items that you had on the list? Because I'd say, looking at that, it'd be a limited time position, at least where you wouldn't. you'd
That
have-
allows the estimated project management capacity to climb with option 3 there.
It would be somebody that I would see at all of our construction meetings as we go through the referendum. So as we're going, like right now, if we were at a construction process right now at this construction meeting, so be myself, Steve, John. Electrical, we'd have our electrician there, et cetera. This person would be at those meetings. So it would also help oversee not only just the projects that are equated on this sheet, but also kind of the whole project management to help us with that.
It really wouldn't be that difficult for us to grab the documents from 2010 and send them out again. So it just would give you information to look at. And you could always decide, holy cow, those costs have really gone up, or you know what? Maybe you do find someone in the community who says, hey, I would do this for the next 3 years for X. I mean, you don't know unless you try it. So I don't have any concerns
Throwing it
trying.
out there. We could also go to some of our colleagues in other districts that are in referendums who have owners reps and see kind of what their rate is that they're paying. That's an option. I'm not sure. We can at least explore that.
Would be a good idea. To explore, snap together.
We can look at, why don't we start there? We can kind of look at the cost, and then if you'd like us to throw the RFP out, if it seems reasonable, what some other districts are paying, we can explore it.
I think so.
Maybe you and I can talk, Steve, and see who's doing our
Sure.
referendums and each other.
That sounds good.
Anything else?
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Stay here for the budget committee.
Yes.
Don't run off.
If you leave, Dave, there's no quorum.
Yeah.
Is that why